Good morning. This is Omni View, episode 23 for March 26, 2026. Multiple perspectives, one briefing. Let's look at the day's news from every angle. The Middle East situation remains the dominant story this morning, with fresh tensions between Iran, Israel, and the United States showing no signs of easing. Iran has firmly rejected a peace proposal put forward by President Trump, describing it as one-sided and essentially a pretext for further military action, possibly even a ground invasion. Iranian officials have been vocal in their criticism, arguing that the plan fails to address core security concerns on their side while demanding significant concessions. Meanwhile, Israeli officials announced that they have killed Iran's naval commander, Alireza Tangsiri, claiming he played a central role in efforts to disrupt shipping through the strategically vital Strait of Hormuz. Live updates from the region paint a picture of increasing chaos, with reports of military movements, rising fears over potential disruptions to global oil supplies, and the Pentagon reportedly developing contingency plans that could involve American ground troops. The situation carries echoes of past crises in the Gulf, where control of the strait has repeatedly become a flashpoint for wider conflict. What's particularly notable is how different outlets are framing these developments. The Daily Mail presents Iran's rejection as an act of defiance in the face of active U.S. and Israeli military operations against Tehran, emphasizing Tehran's vow to defend itself at all costs. In contrast, The Guardian reports both the Iranian dismissal of the proposal and the Israeli claims about the naval commander's death, while also noting President Trump's repeated statements that Tehran is actually desperate for a deal. The Guardian further includes comments from an Iranian envoy suggesting that South Korean vessels would need prior coordination to safely pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Both publications agree that active fighting is occurring and that the strait remains critically important for global energy markets. Where they diverge is in emphasis. The Mail tends to highlight immediate military realities and what it sees as Iranian aggression, while The Guardian focuses more on the diplomatic maneuvering and raises questions about whether current military buildups are genuinely creating pathways toward de-escalation or simply locking all sides into a dangerous spiral. What's interesting here is how clearly the coverage reflects differing priorities, one side stressing hard security concerns and the other giving more weight to diplomatic risks and potential humanitarian costs. The question worth considering is how further escalation might affect civilians across the region and what the independently verified facts actually are regarding the reported death of the Iranian naval chief. These details matter because missteps in this environment could have consequences that stretch far beyond the immediate battlefield. Shifting from the Middle East to the domestic front, we're seeing how these international tensions are already creating very real strains inside the United States. Almost 500 airport security staff have now left their jobs as a protracted funding standoff between the Trump administration and Congress continues to drag on. The dispute is rooted in deep disagreements over the administration's immigration enforcement priorities, which have become entangled with broader budget negotiations. Despite multiple rounds of talks, no breakthrough has been reached, leaving TSA operations increasingly stretched thin at a time when reliable airport security is essential for both safety and economic reasons. This situation has been building for some time as competing policy goals have repeatedly taken precedence over routine government funding matters. Different perspectives on this development are worth noting. The Guardian frames the staff shortages as a direct and predictable consequence of a prolonged Department of Homeland Security funding impasse tied to larger immigration policy battles. Its coverage also notes that the White House has convened multiple cabinet-level meetings on the issue. Views on responsibility vary sharply depending on the source. Some reporting places the primary emphasis on the administration's strong focus on enforcement measures, while other accounts highlight what they see as congressional inaction or unwillingness to compromise on funding bills. What stands out is how this story illustrates the way high-level policy priorities can cascade downward to create very practical strains on everyday infrastructure that millions of Americans rely on. The question worth considering is how long these operations can continue safely with significantly reduced staff, and what the cumulative impact is already having on travelers trying to move through the system. It's a reminder that abstract budget disputes often translate into concrete inconveniences and potential risks on the ground. Meanwhile, the economic ripples from the Middle East conflict are being felt even in the United Kingdom, where they are now being cited as a factor in domestic policy negotiations. Health Secretary Wes Streeting has issued a firm deadline to resident doctors, telling them they must accept the current pay offer or risk losing it entirely, with the warning that future deals will not be more generous. The British Medical Association has responded by announcing plans for a 6-day strike. Streeting has explicitly linked the constrained fiscal environment to the economic pressures created by the ongoing Iran-related conflict, arguing that it leaves the government with limited room to improve its offer. This development sits within a longer pattern of tension between the UK government and healthcare unions over pay, staffing, and working conditions in the National Health Service. Different perspectives on this are worth noting. The Guardian tends to report Streeting's comments within the broader context of UK politics and ongoing union action by doctors. The Daily Mail, by comparison, frames the Health Secretary's approach as strong-arm tactics against striking doctors. Both outlets agree that a specific offer is currently on the table and that a significant strike is now scheduled. They differ mainly in tone and emphasis, with the Mail highlighting what it sees as pressure tactics, while The Guardian places the story alongside other related political and economic developments. What's interesting is how an international conflict is being directly invoked to shape and constrain domestic labor negotiations in a completely different country. The question worth considering is how significant the projected economic effect of the Iran conflict actually is on public finances in countries like the UK, and whether this argument is being used primarily as leverage or reflects genuine fiscal limitations. In the world of business, a notable trend is emerging among top corporate leadership. Several outgoing CEOs of major companies, including Coca-Cola's James Quincy and former Walmart CEO Doug McMillon, have publicly stated that the next wave of artificial intelligence developments is playing a significant role in their decisions to step down from their roles. This goes beyond the usual reasons for executive transitions and suggests that some of the most experienced business leaders are finding the pace and implications of AI advancement particularly challenging to navigate at this stage in their careers. The comments reflect a broader sense that the corporate landscape is entering a period of profound technological transformation that may require different kinds of leadership going forward. CNBC has reported these executives directly linking recent AI breakthroughs to their departure decisions. The coverage suggests that the speed of technological change is prompting leadership turnover at the highest levels of global business. What's interesting is that this may signal deeper uncertainty, not just about specific tools, but about how fundamentally AI could reshape corporate strategy, competitive advantages, and even the core responsibilities of a CEO in the coming decade. The question worth considering is what skills and experiences future CEOs will need most in an AI-driven environment, and whether other senior executives are quietly contemplating similar moves as the technology continues to accelerate. In international sports governance, a major policy shift has been announced that is likely to generate substantial debate. The International Olympic Committee has decided to implement a ban on transgender and DSD athletes from competing in all women's sports events. The new policy will require a once-in-a-lifetime SRY gene test designed to protect fairness, safety, and the overall integrity of the female category. This decision is expected to directly affect several high-profile athletes who have been at the center of previous eligibility controversies, including Laurel Hubbard and Imani Khelif. The Daily Mail has presented this as a significant and welcome step towards safeguarding women's competition. Its coverage notes that the policy will prevent certain athletes who have featured prominently in earlier gender eligibility debates from competing in women's categories. What's interesting about this development is how it reflects the ongoing and often heated global conversation about how best to balance principles of inclusion with the practical demands of competitive fairness in elite sport. These issues have been simmering for years, but the IOC's decision represents one of the most decisive interventions to date. The question worth considering is exactly how the SRY gene test will be implemented in practice and what reactions we can expect from the affected athletes and the various advocacy groups on all sides of this issue. One of the threads that connects several of these stories is the way governments and institutions are navigating resource constraints, whether financial, military, or organizational. To really understand some of the coverage around international alliances, it's worth taking a closer look at how NATO burden sharing actually works, because most reporting tends to simplify it considerably. Most stories treat disputes over NATO spending as a straightforward question of whether allies are paying their fair share. But the often cited 2% of GDP target is a guideline rather than a binding legal obligation under any treaty. Different countries measure and report their defense spending using methodologies that can be difficult to compare directly, which adds another layer of complexity. Here's how the system actually functions. NATO members agreed at the 2014 Wales Summit to work towards spending 2% of their gross domestic product on defense by 2024. There is also a separate target that 20% of that defense spending should go toward major equipment purchases. Importantly, there is no enforcement mechanism or automatic penalty for failing to meet these targets. Instead, they function as political commitments and a form of peer pressure benchmark. Each country self-reports its figures using NATO's agreed definitions, which sometimes include items such as military pensions or certain infrastructure projects that national budgets might classify differently. This creates space for both genuine increases in capability and what some critics call creative accounting. The United States has historically accounted for roughly 2/3 of total NATO defense spending, which gives Washington significant leverage in these conversations, but also makes it particularly sensitive to any perception that it is carrying a disproportionate share of the burden. Understanding these mechanics changes how we should interpret news claims about who is meeting targets or whether one leader successfully pressured others to spend more. It allows us to ask whether reported increases represent real improvements in combat capability or simply changes in how spending is categorized. It also encourages us to consider whether the timing of these announcements aligns more with domestic political needs than with pure strategic assessment. The current narrative around European nations raising their spending significantly in 2025, while President Trump questions NATO's usefulness in the context of the Iran campaign, becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of voluntary guidelines rather than contractual obligations. Next time you encounter a headline about NATO spending or burden sharing, it's worth asking exactly what is being counted as defense expenditure, who benefits from that particular measurement, what the historical precedent for these targets actually is, and most importantly, how that reported spending translates into genuine military capability that could be deployed in a real crisis. Before we go, keep an eye on developments in the funding standoff affecting airport security operations, as well as any further statements regarding the Iran peace proposal in the coming hours. That wraps up today's Omni View. Remember, the best informed people read more than one perspective. If this show helps you do that, share it with someone who values fair coverage. See you tomorrow. This podcast is curated by Patrick, but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice using ElevenLabs. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy, and I hope others do as well.
Without taking the dive, we went on vacation. We had a nice time. My doomsday